It's past 5:30, and we want to welcome everyone out on this bright and sunny afternoon for another meeting of your Danville City Commission. I want to welcome you to this meeting, and it's a special call meeting, and we have on the agenda just one item. But I'm going to turn the meeting over to the city manager, and he's going to give us some brief comments, and then we'll proceed with the meeting. But we're going to have some staff reports, and when those staff reports are finished, we will then proceed to have some comments, presentations, 3 minutes or less made by the public, and then we'll conclude with some commission questions or comments or discussions, and hopefully go home pretty soon. So, City Manager, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Commissioner Atkins. Let me also add my welcome to everyone for coming out on this night, which isn't the best weather-wise, but perhaps for the next hour, give or take, a little more, a little less, we want to engage in a conversation with each of you here if you have anything that you wish to say about public art and the approval process that we have currently in place. Staff thought it would be a good idea to begin this conversation in the effort to look at what other communities may be doing in Kentucky or nationally to deal with the issue of art in public places in their historic district or in their cultural district. And so Joni House, at our request, has spent some time looking into that and will be giving a presentation tonight. We thought we would also encourage comments from the audience at this beginning point in the conversation. I will say that there are no great conclusions or decisions to be reached tonight. It's simply the beginning of a conversation because I think we all want a process that showcases our town in terms of its historic assets as well as the art that we deem to be appropriate to be included in our historic district. And so this is an issue that as you travel about the country, you see more and more art, murals, and so we want to see what process that we can have that will effectively work in our community. And so with that very much beginning, or a very short beginning, we'll ask Joni to make her presentation, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Good evening. It is a exceedingly nasty night for everybody to be out, so we will get through this. And what I want everybody to understand is what we're talking about tonight is specifically for the historic district. This is what we deal with when we are looking at public art within the historic district. So we're going to introduce you to some terms and some of our processes really that just are for the historic district. If there's other questions about other areas of town, I'm probably not your girl to answer that. So let's start out with, let me make sure I'm working this right. What is an architectural review board supposed to do? Well, it's pretty clear. The end goal for DAHB is to minimize any potential negative impacts in the historic district while concurrently allowing for active, practical use of our heritage spaces in a way that sustain them as economic and cultural assets. What does this really mean? Well, in Danville, I would say that we bring in $3 to $4 million in cultural tourism every year. So our historic district is a huge part of that. So our DAHB really does have a responsibility to take care of that economic driver. And some of the things that we do specifically with the Architectural Heritage Board are meant to support that economic impact. So that is what they are actually charged with doing. DAHB in Danville, it's pretty similar across the nation what those charges are as Architectural Heritage Boards. There's not really any large variance in that. It pretty much is the same from Shelbyville, Kentucky to Portland, Oregon in what DAHB or Architectural Review Boards are actually charged with. So I wanted to make sure everybody understands what our charge actually is, because I know sometimes there's a lot of questions about that. And what is public art actually? What is the definition of public art that DAHB looks at? Now, this might not be the definition of everybody's, what their idea of public art is, but this is what DAHB defines public art as per our guidelines. It can take a variety of forms, from the reinterpretation of functional features of the streetscape, such as a bicycle rack, to the design of a gateway icon or mural painting. A lot of people don't think that, but a bike rack can be public art within the cityscape. Public art is an investment in the cultural capital of the community. Again, it is an investment in our economic drivers. This is one of the main features of our town, is our historic integrity. It supports aesthetic tourism and community pride. Public art in the historic district. Public art in the historic overlay district should enhance cultural identity of a community and provide opportunities for the interpretation, the history, and character of the area through a variety of medium that complement the historic building stock. That is what our charge is when we look at public art in the historic district. Guidance on public art in historic spaces. I'm a creature that lives and dies by the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Historic Preservation. I have looked through all the technical guidelines. I've talked to the National Park Service. There's just not a lot out there as far as national guidelines go. Basically, in their technical preservation briefs, the National Park Service, which is what CLG gets their standards from, addresses public art by signs. It doesn't matter to them if it's a painted on mural, it's just a sign to them, and they give guidance on that. Basically, the ultimate standard remains for them: masonry walls that have never been painted must never be painted. There's very limited discussion with that. There's a lot of discussion amongst my colleagues, but we're not getting a lot of guidance from the National Park Service. The Kentucky Streetscape Guidelines address the addition of new public art in this way. Public art, whether it 2 or 3 dimensional, should be subject to broad review and consensus, should represent high standards of design and execution, and should consider issues of maintenance and longevity. It does not really speak specifically to historic overlay districts, and there's not much language out there. So I did look quite a bit to see if we had some guidance in the public arena, and this is what I came up with. Danville standards. Our guiding principle: public art should in all cases be sensitively integrated into the fabric of the community so as to enhance rather than detract from or diminish the inherent qualities of the historic district. These are our guidelines. This is the opening statement to what our guidelines say when we look at public art. Now, these are all the guidelines. I pushed one too far. I'm not going to read them all to you guys. They're easily accessible online. This is what we have to look at. If you put a COA up in front of the Danville DAHB, these are the guidelines that they have to go by when they decide the appropriateness of that particular piece of art. They're in the published guidelines. They're online. You can get a copy of this if you like. It's, you know, how you guys read them. There's many ways to do that. And again, more public art. There are some things that we do address when it comes to content specifically, and that is art versus advertisement. Content distinguishes art from signage. There are many communities that look at all art, if it's painted on a building, as a sign. But we in this community look at it as content, which distinguishes art from signage. While signs specifically advertise a business, product, or service, artworks such as murals are designed to be solely artistic in nature. Artwork in the district cannot include trademarks, service marks, or other markings, patterns, or colors readily identifiable with a business, product, or service. The presence of such an element will necessitate review of the feature as a sign rather than public artwork. This is pretty much universal through all historic districts throughout Kentucky and through the United States. If it has a commercial meaning to it or a commercial element, they look at it as a sign and not art. Now, our process is pretty simple. If you come in front of us, you have to fill out the certificate of appropriateness application. You fill that out. There are some things that we require that you turn in with that, specifically a final and complete design. Photograph of the site location, photographs of adjacent areas, letters from the property owner indicating that it's okay for you to put the said artwork on that property, and completed and signed maintenance plan for the designated life of the mural, which basically says we're going to take care of it, and not only we're going to take care of it, but how we're going to take care of that. These are some of the things that we require. Obviously, if you're doing this, the more the better. Any information that you can put with that would help that process along. What are other communities doing? Well, I looked at probably 25 communities within Kentucky and throughout the United States. There are many examples of what other communities do, and I think probably, well, I can tell you the main theme is everybody does it very different. It's very eclectic, and it's also very unique to the different communities that are going through this processes. It's a very new process in the historic districts. I've come to realize that. A lot of the districts have not had any mechanism to handle it at all. But a lot of communities do. Manassas, Virginia, I thought might be of interest to you guys because of their Civil War heritage, and of course I love the Civil War, so I speak to that often. They have very extensive review process, but they really mirror Danville's criteria. They go through basically the same process as we do. So very similar to ours. Covington, not so much. Covington, they basically just said it should be sensitive to the surrounding area, and it cannot have a commercial sign. That is their standard actually for their guidelines. So if you go in front of the Architectural Review Board in Covington, that is what they're going to judge their certificate of appropriateness against, is those two things. Bardstown, Kentucky, very interesting. Bardstown's kind of a similar size of us. They have an extremely historic downtown. They're known throughout the United States for their history. And so I called over there and had a great conversation with those folks. And they basically told me, if it's a symbol, a pictorial, a design, a painting, a graphic, it's a sign. They use them. There is no distinguishing between a work of art that's painted on a building and a sign. And it's all handled by their planning and zoning. That is for freestanding art as well. They run it through planning and zoning because the city owns the sidewalks, therefore they let planning and zoning have it. They do have some pretty stringent sign criteria. If you have one sign, you can only have 11% of the facade. That's it. If you have two signs, you can have 9% of the facade taken up. So that's how Bardstown handled it. I looked at Savannah, Georgia. I looked at Shelbyville, Kentucky. There's all kinds of different ways to do it. Portland, Oregon, they completely exempt their murals from the Historic Design Review for their AHB board. They have another Regional Arts and Cultural Council board that has the decision on it. The one thing that I did see is their guidelines are very similar. They won't allow painting on structures that haven't been painted. There's some pretty stringent guidelines for that. But their Architectural Heritage Board, they don't touch that at all. So if you stick your finger on a map, you're going to find a community that does it completely different or similar or a mixture of both than we do it. And that's pretty much our process and how we go through it. And then I wanted to put in there what other communities do. If there was a really good way to handle this, I thought maybe we would find it, but I found out there's a lot of good ways to handle it. But it needs to be unique to our community, and we need to figure out how it's going to work for us, as most of these communities have done. Now, that was probably a little quicker than I thought I was going to get through it, but I'm happy to go on and talk with you guys about what you need to do, or we can take comment.
Was there a recurring theme in any of them, or?
The recurring themes are pretty, you cannot paint on unpainted masonry. That is a very recurrent theme. There seems to be a theme of it needs to fit into the community sensitively. Now, that's a very broad definition. Right.
Right.
What does that mean exactly? But no, the major theme is that everybody handles it very differently. And it doesn't matter if it's a small city or a very large city. Savannah had about 6 pages of what you could do to actually introduce public art into Savannah. It's quite a complicated process. They charge quite a lot to get it through the process, so there's just different ways. But the theme is there's no real good,
No theme.
no real good footprint of it, how to get it done.
So there was no definition of what sensitively integrated means?
No. Boy, I wish there was. And that's why I looked in the federal government, obviously, who tries to give out good guidelines through the preservation areas. That is what we really kind of look at everything in preservation. It has to be with the Secretary's Standards of the Interior. That's our Bible, so to speak. There's pretty much nothing. There's really no national guidelines. And one of the reasons I think that is because it's such a new situation. A lot of cities use the murals for blighted areas, for buildings that are going through blight. That seems to be something they utilize the murals for a great deal. And then some cities just have public art programs, you know, so everybody handles it very differently. And the Secretary of Interior standards are kind of like, sorry. So,
You know, I think a
fortunately,
phrase
no.
like that is intentionally ambiguous,
Right.
so as to allow, you know, the discretion of the controlling authority to have some leeway from time to time as times change.
Right.
One thing that I thought I heard, Joni, was in common in all of these places that you may have looked at is the distinction between art and a sign.
Correct. That
Now,
is correct.
There may be different definitions of what constitutes a sign.
Right.
But if it is intended to promote a commercial activity, it falls within the sign
That's correct.
regulation.
That
So-
is correct.
so-
Then that seems to be pretty universal for every historic district. Generally, if someone wants to, and I will tell you, Versailles gave me a very good example of that. They had one of the local distilleries paint a distilling, I guess a still. They didn't put their name on it, but they had that. Obviously, it represents bourbon, but there was no name or anything associated with it. Then they had a proposal to do one with the two racehorses that have won the Triple Crown. I think Coolmore Stud is standing them stud. They were going to paint a mural of both the stud horses, but Coolmore wanted to put a giant Coolmore Stud, and they would not let them do that, so they backed out on that mural. So anything that really kind of promotes any service or anything, they look at it, seem to be looking at it as commercial.
One thing I think that's interesting is that it seems to be a spectrum upon review of other communities, that they view either artwork as, on one end of the spectrum would be like Bardstown, the extreme, that everything's a sign, period. Whether it's art, you know, by the definition or not, it's a sign and thus regulated by planning and zoning. That's one part of the spectrum. The opposite side of the spectrum says, no, we're gonna differentiate between art and signage if there is no commercial message. If there's no commercial message conveyed, then they're saying that there is perhaps some some differences in how they're regulated and adhere to different regulations in different communities, but they're regulated differently than signage. But I think it's interesting that if at the moment's notice of a commercial message, it shifts to immediate definition of a sign, thus falls in the regulations of planning and zoning and the sign regulations. So that's one common factor. I think another common factor is, or it's something to realize, rather, oftentimes we gravel with different issues in this community and we think we're the only ones that are dealing with it, or things are so much more difficult here than maybe other places, or that's what we're told anyway. But I think in a review of this situation, you see that municipalities really coast to coast are struggling with, in fact, how to deal with this.
Yes.
There's not a quote-unquote best practice for signage or art regulation in historic districts. It's fascinating. I mean, but what we're saying is we're in good company in trying to find a solution that works for our community. Again, we're probably not going to answer that question tonight, and maybe not even in a month or two. But we're not alone, is the point. But we do have an opportunity to help decide what's best for the community and how it could be regulated here. And you have some extremes, and
Yes.
maybe we fall on one of those extremes, or maybe there's some common ground that's achieved. But you really have a host of options at this
You do
point.
have a host of options. That is the one thing I thought that really surprised me. I thought, you know, we would find some tide of commonness throughout all these communities that have historic districts, and there's just not. You know, there are very restrictive ones, and then there are those that are not. So it really does run the whole spectrum of it. When I saw Bridget, I was like, gee, I wish I could, you know, tell you I found the answer, but it's just not there.
So do you, from your point of view and your position and your research, do you have any suggestions about what might work best for the city and for you and codes and planning and zoning?
Well, for us, I think the one thing that we decided that would help us work through it is that we would require a final and complete design completely before the COA comes up for review with DAHB. That would help us a lot in some of the issues that we had before. So that's one change that we're going to make, that we're going to require. Just like if someone wants to come with a window, it needs to be finalized before we get it.
And let's be specific about that, Joni. I don't mean to interrupt,
Sure.
but just to make sure we're on the same page. What had happened in the past is sometimes applicants would get a location approved.
Right.
And then go seek a mural and bring it back. So AHB would say, okay, that's an appropriate location. They would approve it contingent upon a final design that would come back and for basically a second approval after the site had been approved.
Right.
What staff has made a determination is to make it more akin to what would occur in a normal planning and zoning process, and that is that you would bring forth a complete design, select a site and a design to allow the board, AHB, to have a thorough review of it at a single meeting. So not to pre-approve a location and then a mural or art form, what any other form
Whatever,
it may
right.
be, but rather have an application that chooses both site and design.
Right.
It would be akin to planning and zoning approving a location for a development without seeing a site plan. Well, they would never do that. Shouldn't and wouldn't. And the process should be similar to that in AHB for an efficiency standpoint.
Right, and that will help us with our charge to say yes or no, or approve it or disapprove it. Now, the advice that I will give, the community must decide what they value as art in all parts of this city. All of these communities have grappled with that. They've come up with a lot of different ways, and you have the public sitting here tonight, so it might be a good opportunity for them to suggest some ways to you, because in the end, it is our community, so we all have to come to a consensus of what we appreciate and what we think is appropriate in the historic district. There's going to be some disagreement, there always is, but there's obviously ways that we can work and get through this process much easier, and still value the city. What do you say about sensitively, how does it sensitively get into your community? That's a big one, fellas and ladies. I don't know how to tell you how to do that. That is the question, I suppose, of the night. So how do you do that?
So and it says here, final and complete design under our process. So we haven't been doing that? Just that?
Well, we approved the building first, because the way it was set up is they came and the Architectural Heritage Board said yes or no to the building. And then they came back with the final design. So what we would like to see is it all done at one time, so that there's not multiple meetings and possibility of misunderstandings or miscommunications in any way. So when they come in front of AHB now, we want to see the whole design, everything laid out and finished, which is the way we do it with everything else.
If I could interject a comment. To me, it seems to be a bit of a challenge to have one hearing and make a decision based upon a final design that sensitively is to be incorporated in the community. As art is subjective and people have different opinions. And while it's desirable to have a final design on which to base a decision, there was, I think, suggested by some members of the community, and they may speak tonight or at a future point in time, and like other communities, in some cases they have appointed people who have knowledge with art or certain viewpoints that are valued in the community. It may not all be artists, but you've got sort of, in effect, an advisory committee or something to help make a recommendation on the art. And I don't know if that's something that is common in other areas. The example up here in terms of Regional Arts and Culture Council, for example, in Portland, I would just suppose those are comprised of artists and other individuals in the community.
They are, from artists and other individuals in the communities. A lot of what I see there are committees, advisory committees that look at different things and make recommendations back. They have no real final say. Of course, the architectural heritage boards have the final say, but they make a recommendation for that particular piece of art. And they're not just made up of artists, they're made up of different people in the community. It's not just like art professors or artists, it's a lot of very diverse group of individuals in the
So
community.
potentially, that could maybe be a process used in Danville
Certainly.
as we look at what works in other communities.
Sure, and going along with that, perhaps even a broader idea, an alternate, as opposed to having an appointed advisory committee of some sort that would be comprised of people that you may appoint. It may benefit the community to help have a say in what is this sensitive integration into the district by, if a completed design is presented to the AHB at an initial meeting, it's simply a presentation only, and then maybe if it sits for 30 days to allow for a public review and to actually have a public hearing to allow public input, maybe not from an advisory committee, but anyone who may choose to come and speak for or against it may be an appropriate process as well. I mean, we have a similar process when we go through like naming a city street or things of that nature where ideas are suggested, some rise to the top. We allow a 30-day breath period where people can digest it
Sure.
and come and then make comment and before you make your final decision. So we do have some precedent for that. I think in order to make these critical decisions for downtown, the more public input provided in, or more buy-in that the public has, or at least an opportunity for under a transparent, open meeting, could make whatever decision is made more tolerable when the temperature of the public is gauged. So perhaps either through a committee you may appoint, or by simply holding a public hearing required on any installation of art in the historic district could prove beneficial, which would allow any citizen to make a comment and not just a committee.
Right.
The city manager made a point in a pre-planning meeting on a story he'd heard on NPR that suggested that we are all artists, or art is innate in all of us to some degree, and perhaps not with a paintbrush or whatever that may be, but even in the style in which we dress, the way we decorate our home, the way we landscape our yard. We all have artistic traits within us that express themselves in some way. I mean, we can think of nothing that's more subjective
Right.
than art.
And you know, the city of Savannah, they actually do have a period where the public can comment, because they're very specific in their guidelines, and they say that if a mural is to go up in a neighborhood, that neighborhood has to be in complete agreement with it. So they hold a little city or a neighborhood meeting actually to make sure that the neighborhood is okay with it. So that's a way to go too. I mean, the good thing is there's a lot of good ways we can go to involve the community. It's just,
And in that way, it'd be similar to a zone change request that planning and zoning would have.
Well,
in
that's
which
what I was going to mention,
they
was
would,
the planning
have
and
a public
zoning does
hearing.
that, and the
Right.
Board of Adjustments
Oh, sure.
conducts their meetings that way.
I mean, to me, we've suggested a couple things tonight that could greatly improve the public input into the process, one of which would be a public hearing on any proposed art in the historic district. Another is to provide a completed design which would allow the public to have that input.
yes,
This is pretty clear. The devil is always in the details.
you better believe it, right?
But I wonder, as you looked at towns, did you see, what I'm having a problem with is historic district. Did you see any towns that separated? When I think of our historic district, there's Main Street, and there's other places.
Yes.
Did any, for instance, have sort of an arts area within a historic district that they would treat differently?
Well, there are numerous examples of gradation within historic districts. Certainly in towns generally much larger than Danville, Santa Fe, New Mexico comes to mind. Within that particular area, they have buildings that are World Heritage Sites that are 400 years old. The list of thou shall not do's in that district is extreme. But then 3 neighborhoods away, there's transitional areas where they have those things. What I see in the smaller communities, it's pretty much a historic district downtown, and that's it.
It would be hard to decide, I know.
Certainly. In Paducah, some of the places that have large flood walls along the Kentucky River, the Ohio River, they will transform that into an arts district. Some of those are actually downtown, but the flood walls provide a great, canvas for people to paint on. So, like Paducah, right? So I see that also. But what I'm mainly seeing in towns the size of Danville, it's pretty much all in the historic district or out of the historic district, and then the rules for the historic district, they're trying to figure out how to handle it. But yeah, there's opportunity out there and around to discuss that.
The easiest way to do it, I'm trying to think.
Sure, right, right,
Ideas.
right. I mean, there's lots of different ways to do it. That's the good thing about it. Anybody else? I'm waiting. I can make up something good for
Was there
you.
anyone else from staff who wants to make some comments? And then we'll,
I want to make one more comment, and that's simply an invitation, really, to not only those in attendance tonight, but to the commissioners as well. This is meant to be a starting point. Certainly, no questions were intended to be answered tonight, but it would be beneficial in trying to gauge a solution to the problem, or craft one, rather, that if you have questions, suggestions, concerns, that they actually be written and provided to staff so that some type of recommendation can actually be crafted. That would be beneficial as opposed to simply staff coming up with a recommendation without that input.
Right.
Because as you can see today, without some guidance, the options are just rather plentiful.
They are, very much so. And again, the large driver to all of this, it is a desire within the communities to make what works best for their own community. So the individuality of the different things really kind of speaks well for how different communities are dealing with their historic districts. That people care so much, that's a good indicator that we're doing the right thing in the protection of those resources.
And as for process as well, before anything is actually adopted by the commission, there would be a change. I think it would be wise to have a sitting period after a recommendation is made to allow various sectors of the community to comment on them. Either what are the pluses and the minus. Anyone invested in the arts community and otherwise may wish to comment on it. So I think before anything would be actually voted on, I think it would be wise, after it's recommended by staff through the process, that there be a sitting period for public comment, particularly on an issue like this where there will be a lot of concern in the community on how it's treated and regulated.
Yes.
Public comment.
Okay.
Out of some of the research you did. So the difference between the written design guidelines and the process for approval. Can you tell in your research on some of these other design guidelines how engaged with content that the designing boards actually get? Because I'm thinking like for example, are they requiring final designs? That's not written into any of the guidelines that you shared, but it doesn't mean they're not doing it. And I
Right.
wonder if you could give us any sense of
Well,
writing that is different than saying like having it in writing versus how they're
Right. Well, I will tell you, in Bardstown,
Yeah.
you have to, whatever you're going to put on that building has to be produced as a final design. It's got to be right there. And then there are other communities that have a lot of varying practices on it. There's communities that have committees that help shepherd it through. Is that what they're looking at in writing? I haven't really seen a lot of, this is what the content must be in writing, or this is what the content must not be in writing. And I think probably intentionally so, because you get into a lot of issues with that. So there seems to be a lot of trying to help the process along, but not a lot of stuff in writing where it says, no, you cannot put a pink poodle and a tutu on this billboard. It's just, that's not there. Did I answer your question mostly? Okay. Mostly. Yes, ma'am.
It just occurred to me that I wonder if you need a two-tier process or a two-path process. Because if you go with public opinion, it becomes like one of those web contests that just whoever gets the most votes.
Right.
But then that doesn't just consider the economic impact that that can have on everyone's property and investment.
Right.
And if you have a path where it's all, egghead artists, if there is such a thing, who get to decide what is art, which of course no one can really codify aesthetics and aesthetic discernment.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you could have those two paths, and then the final decision would be made from the recommendation of artists and people who have studied art history and understand the economics and what would be appropriate, and then also have what everybody likes and wants who lives here, and then weigh the results of those two contests.
I assume so. That would be something to work out in a process. The quick answer to that is yes, we could do that. Now, how we got there, right.
Otherwise, there's no good way to get to where you want to go.
Sure, right, and that's the problem. That is the problem. Yes, ma'am.
So I just want a point of clarification. It seems like we're talking about more murals than anything else.
Right.
So is that what we're doing, or are you open to?
No, it is all public art. When,
Okay, so, and consequently, a piece of three-dimensional something.
Yes.
May not really be on a wall.
correct,
It's going to be out there somewhere.
correct.
So how does, like, the book bench project in Lexington?
Yes, uh-huh.
Okay. Where would something like that fit into this process that you're talking about?
Well, currently, the way it is set up, it would go through the same process that any piece of art, any mural or anything in this city, currently the way the process is set up, because those design guidelines are for all public art. It doesn't differentiate between murals and public art.
I think it would be helpful if we didn't always use the word mural.
Well, correct, right, I understand.
But, okay, and in terms of who owns the property and that sort of thing, with all that, it's not private sometimes, right?
Well, as in Bardstown, if it's on public property, if it's on the public sidewalk, they determine that is within the public realm, and it goes to their Planning and Zoning Commission for any freestanding art that they have.
So that needs to be allowed for, you think, because we seem to not have allowed for something like that.
Well, right, that would be a question that's really not suited for me to answer, ma'am. I don't know what the codes and ordinances would need to do that. I can tell you that within the design guidelines that we have currently, it addresses all public art. So the process would be the same. Currently, if it's a piece of statuary standing out on the sidewalk and/or mural painted on the wall, it doesn't really differentiate currently between that. I think I answered that right. Did I answer that?
Our current guideline says for freestanding public art, consider naturally iconic locations such as gateways, civic facilities, and public open spaces. But again, if you have the design and the location together and are considering that instead of separately, then that changes everything, in my opinion.
Well, it's certainly going to do it for freestanding sculpture. Because
And I don't know to change everything that ever comes up, but I want to get my wall approved, a location. I don't mind coming back to get the work, the design approved, but I'm not going to go out and get someone to do a design for me and have you tell me that my wall's not appropriate. So a lot of discussion though. There's a hand in the back, and I think we're still in the part where, are you all asking questions to the staff presenter? Or are you ready to make public comments and suggestions?
Whatever you
Yeah, so Ms. Brown, you have a question, or you want to comment?
No, I want to make a public comment, so if we're still,
Well, let's do this.
He has to go get-
Any other questions for the, yeah?
Are you aware of Banksy, the English art?
I am,
Okay.
yes.
I mean, he does his stuff. Nobody allegedly knows what he looks
Right,
like.
right,
He comes in,
Does
does
it.
something on a public wall, and goes away.
right.
Not, what would happen? And then these things start.
Well, you know, it's been put up in the historic district without the application and the correct process. So, you know, that is against the ordinance. And he's gotten himself in trouble with some of that, as I understand, too. Yeah, yeah.
You know, people take, but what's the difference between public art, or how do you see it, and graffiti? Like a Banksy, I mean, Banksy is sometimes called a graffiti artist.
Well, to me, public art goes through the process of approval within the historic district. Graffiti does not. I mean, that is my blanket. If you want to put it up in the historic district, it needs to go through that process. So
But he was just across the street from the historic district.
that'd be planning and zoning. So, I mean, but to answer your question, it has to go through the public art. It has to go through the process. Yeah, I'm throwing Steve under the bus.
But I think it's important to do that, because if it goes up and it's on my house and I didn't approve it, I'm painting over it.
You might want to consider keeping the piece though, because it's a
Yeah, they're worth a lot of money.
$1 million.
No, you said just common, everyday graffiti, you know, my artwork. You know, I'm painting over it, but, you know, it depends on the source, so.
That's true.
It's all in the eye.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not staff, but
You're not staff? Oh,
okay, if I could maybe make a comment based on the zoning ordinance and the relationship between the two.
yes, sir.
Should go up there,
Yes, sir.
or you want?
Now, you might have come up here, because it'll be recorded. Yeah, you
Yeah,
should,
I'll
yeah.
just do this. So, one thing, I'm just thinking out loud here, what I'm struggling with is, well, first off, we got good guidance from the city attorney initially, because the zoning ordinance clearly defines what's a sign, okay? So, when we're out of the historic district, it's pretty straightforward. Everything's a sign. If it's a graphic representation, it's letters, it's a box, draws any kind of attention, it's a sign. What I've been struggling with on the murals have been, and I think Stephen hit it right on, is the board has done it accurately. They come in and decide, is it public art or is it a sign? Do we follow this section of the design guidelines, or do we follow the previous pages for the sign regulations? If it's public art, we don't follow the planning and zoning rules, because obviously we'd have all kinds of conflicts between the two. We say it's public art, we follow those design guidelines, and the staff's been sort of walking the board on through. But I think what's lacking in the design guidelines is maybe just some more kind of measurables in there. I think what I'm thinking is we're going too deep into the design and the artistic end, and reason I think that is we're working on revising the sign ordinance as we speak. And in the zoning ordinance, it's become very clear we don't need to get into message and design. We are regulating bulk and height and size and location. In context of those areas in town, there might be a situation that this percentage is better on a certain building versus this percentage. I think the design guidelines lack maybe some more measurables, like thou shalt not paint a mural on an unpainted building. I don't know why we don't have a facade percentage, or no murals should be more than 2 stories, or public art shouldn't be taller than 40% of the principal structure. I think if our design guidelines had some more measurables in there like that, we could get away from even trying to regulate or discuss the content, which is where we're going to be with signs anyhow. I don't see how we wouldn't be consistent. The other thing I'm struggling with is I look at the historic district as the most important area of the community in the sense, and I look at those design guidelines in relation to the zoning ordinance, and I struggle with the fact that the mural that we did on the building right next door, even though it's public art, we say it's not a sign, but as soon as we step 5 foot out of the historic district, a gentleman or someone that owns a building there can't put up but something that's 1/4 of that size. So we've said, well, that's not a sign. It's confusing to the public that in the historic district, we can put a design 5 times the size that anyone else can put on their building anywhere else in town. And because it's under the guise of public art, it's got letters, it's got a message. Explain that to the folks out there on the bypass. They're going, why can't I put up a 200 square foot sign on my building? No, they can't. No, no, it would be regulated as a wall sign at 5% of that facade and potentially no bigger than 64 square feet. So again, no, we don't need an art policy. I think our ordinance is on the right track, that we regulate a percentage of the facade as a sensitive way to figure out how much signage is permissible in the building. If you want to go above 5%, you get a variance.
And to that point, I mean.
And I'll just leave it at that.
To that point, I mean, the Supreme Court has, we've had workshop on that. I mean, if there's, they've commented on that, what year was that case? Probably 2015. City, I can't remember that city of. Gilbert, yeah, Gilbert, thank you. In that instance, I mean, the court ruled that if you have to read the sign, then by its nature is a content-based regulation, which is de facto unconstitutional. So to Steve's point, it's that the measurable criteria for signage is appropriate and validated. However, if you have to read the sign to determine what it was, you shouldn't have a different regulation for political signs than you do commercial signs or artistic signs or whatever. They're all driven by measurable items, none of which are content driven. So they are all content neutral regulations. That's the buzzword.
Can we get our art standard somewhere down that path?
Right.
Becomes more uniform, takes the.
Ideally, you would have some measurable standards. I mean, you.
Architectural review after all, if it's about bulk and size. I don't know if it's worked or not.
Well, for instance, that's exactly what Bardstown has done. So Bardstown has said whatever it is a sign, and to that nature, it is going to be regulated in conformance with our sign policy. So whatever it is, graphic, commercial, political, artistic, it's going to be regulated by dimension only. And as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, that would be the safest way to know that it would survive constitutional scrutiny, anyhow. But
I'm ready to relinquish this.
yeah, I'm sure you are.
Well, thank you, ma'am, for that presentation,
Joey.
and thank you all in attendance for the
If
follow-up
I
questions.
may, Mayor Pro Tem, I have one more question before you go to public.
All right.
Yeah, and this is for Counselor Dexter. I kind of liked your idea of a mural presentation coming to AHB, and then there's a 30 days for public comment and so forth. But it kind of sounded like I might have got confused, so I want to be clarified that it's going to that board, not the staff in city. Okay.
Yeah, no, I was giving you.
I
may
think
have
maybe I got
that.
confused and you had two conversations going
I
on.
was using an example of how we name publicly owned facilities or streets, how that comes before you. I may not have been articulate on that point. But no, this would be something that is administered by the AHB. And also, that's not meant to be a two-tiered process, rather, of gauging, of just saying what's popular or what's unpopular. I know things can get that way, but what I'm relating it to would be more akin to a public hearing that's held by planning and zoning for a zone change request or something of that nature. Yes, you are going to have public opinion, and they're going to say they're greatly in favor of it or greatly against it. Now, that is but one thing that the Planning Commission should take into account. Ultimately, they need to decide if it's an appropriate use of the property. Now, public input has helped, so there is buy-in in whatever decision is made, but ultimately the decision is made based upon their regulations, as it should be. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have public comment in a transparent process.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Let's go into the public comment, questions, suggestions, whatever, of this part of the meeting. Please limit your comments, your statements, your suggestions to 3 minutes. 3 minutes or less. I think it stopped snowing, but, okay. So, we are open for public comment. And Ms. Brown, you've been waiting patiently. And remember what I said to you before the meeting started, right?
I forgot, oh, you wanted to know why I was taking so many notes.
No, that's not what I said.
You thought I was making my own guidelines. I ignored him as usual. First of all, I certainly appreciate what Joni has said, and I have no disagreement with her as far as the historic overlay. But I have, of course, been talking about this now for basically 7 years. That's not all of Danville. Danville is, the city of Danville is larger than that. So the review of art and public places by the Architectural Heritage Board is actually just limited to the historic overlay. That's only part of what we ought to be looking at. There was nothing about the announcement of this meeting that said that it was about the historic overlay, nothing whatsoever. It just said this was a discussion on arts and public places. So that's why, I would assume then the city of Danville, because it came from the city of Danville. So I have a few comments. I have been calling for a committee sanctioned by the city to review art in public places. Now, whether that's in the historic overlay district or not, that's just part of it. So I see this as a larger committee that must consult with the Architectural Heritage Board when it is within the historic overlay. But this is much larger than the Architectural Heritage Board. Now, as I said, as far as what they said about buildings and everything else, I go along with that completely. But again, that's in the historic district. There are some things even within that have not been reviewed. I agree with Mimi. There's not enough information about three-dimensional art, and that takes a very specific kind of installation that's way beyond whether we like the art or not. It's just a very big process. Some other things that have not been addressed here. There needs to be an entity to act as an intermediary between, say, the artist or among the artist and the property owner and the paying entity, because they have different, unless the paying entity, for instance, if this is the first time that group has financed public art, then they may not be aware of some of the contractual agreements or requirements. And so this committee should be looking at that type of thing too and make sure that all parties are being represented fairly. And installation plans, of course, have to be reviewed for three-dimensional art. I don't see anything here about the public health and safety. And when you're talking about three-dimensional art that can be climbed or jumped into or whatever, you're talking about something along those lines too that would not be applicable to a mural, obviously. I did not see enough about cultural disrespect and affront. As far as part of the review of this material, sometimes because I'm, a middle-class white Kentuckian, I see things just from my viewpoint. So as long as it's not any affront about a hillbilly or something like that, maybe I don't see the other affront. So that needs to be looked at about cultural disrespect. When the art is publicly funded, there has to be a call to artists. It cannot, the paying entity, if it's publicly funded, cannot just pick an artist. It has to be a call to artists. I didn't see that addressed either. One thing I'm concerned about, and I'm not sure that we haven't already violated this in one of our pieces of public art, and that's copyright. Art is copyrighted for 72 years. 72 years. And because of that image, whatever image it is, whether it's a photograph, a piece of art, whatever it is, if it's an artistic portrayal, that cannot be reproduced in a piece of public art, or really any art, but obviously public art. So these types of things have not been addressed at all in these guidelines. But my biggest thing is that I really still feel that the city of Danville needs a larger committee that's looking through the whole city of Danville. And then the Architectural Heritage Board would chime in or be called in or asked to review anything within a historic district. So I'm calling for a much larger piece, a much larger committee, and then have the Architectural Heritage Board certainly review any kind of art that's within the historic overlay. That would be, and those guidelines may be way beyond something for the city, you know, like painting on a building. You know, that may not even be of interest or have any significance outside the historic overlay, for example. But once we get into that, of course, that's one of the main points we have. So I'm going to call one more time for a larger, broader committee on the review of art in public places. And certainly then, when we're talking about the historical overlay, Architectural Heritage Board must be consulted for that.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Hello. I had a couple thoughts as I've been listening and processing, as you all are, and one of them is fairly philosophical, and I sense that some of what we've been talking about, the goal for some is to make public art as safe as humanly possible. Not physically safe, but to make it as uncontroversial as possible. And I just want to raise a little bit of a caution flag on that, because it seems to assume that the purpose of art is to please the people who look at it. And I would argue that art has a much bigger purpose than that. So when I hear us talking too much down the road of sort of public opinion on art, I just worry about what that can look like down the road and whether that is truly the most important thing to consider when we're looking at public art, because there's a lot of public art that is not meant to make you feel warm and fuzzy inside. It's meant to challenge you. It's meant to make you think about the world differently. It's meant to make you feel really uncomfortable sometimes, and all of that is really good art too. And I just want to make sure that as we're building whatever the guidelines look like, and I think there's been some wonderful suggestions made tonight, I just kind of want to keep that in mind, that the goal is not necessarily to put a process in place that leaves everyone happy all the time, because you won't be able to do it, and I'm not sure that that's the goal of art in any case. I also did want to just make sure, as we're looking at the guidelines, that we would fully recognize what a seismic shift it would be to require a final and complete design. In the presentation, it sort of suggested that that was the way the design guidelines are written, which is not the case. We later sort of verbally acknowledged that right now what's required is a proposed idea or theme. And so to switch to a final and complete design, I know it feels like a really great, easy solution, like, oh, so many problems solved if we could only just see the final design. But to just kind of bear in mind what a huge shift that is from an artistic perspective, and how to balance that with the artistic process of how art is created in a couple different ways. Certainly from the point of view of the funding entity, the financial risk that they would then take on, obviously, because artists, as we discussed in previous meetings, do not work without pay. So the funding agency would be on the hook for a certain amount of money going into a project. And that may be the decision that you just decide. If you want to try for public art, you're rolling the dice and you're going to put some money in that you may lose. But I want to make sure that we're keeping that in mind. That piece, and also then that also sort of weighs into when the city commission or when the AHB wants to get involved with the process, because, for example, like a call to artists, you can't do a call to artists with final artwork. You could do a call for proposals, you could do a call for suggestions, but in terms of, you cannot expect multiple artists to submit final designs without compensation. So either you would be requesting that all of those artists be compensated, or you would be requesting to exploit them by asking them to provide final designs without compensation. So just thinking a little bit about how that process would work. I mean, it could be that, you know, on the back end, an organization would do a call for artists and they would use that to narrow down ideas, again, not final proposals, and then they would then contract with the artist for a final design. But if what we're ever picturing is choosing from 5 fabulous finished designs, that's not how it works, and it shouldn't be how it works, because that's not in the best interest of artists. I think I'm probably getting near my timeline. So those were the two biggest things that I kind of just wanted to throw out there. I don't have answers either. I do think the less you can do to get involved with content, the better your lives will be, because content will always be subjective. I'm with Steve on that. Not sure I would agree with, like, what percentage of the building to cover, but we'll arm wrestle later. But in terms of, the more bold you're willing to be in terms of stepping back from that and just saying, if it's, a well-respected artist, if it's in a place that we all agree on, maybe it's okay if we don't know what the finished product is going to look like, which is terrifying. But if you put it in writing, you can cover yourselves that way too. So thank you so much for all the attention you're giving to this issue. It's exciting to be part of these conversations and to see kind of where we're going to go with those projects. So thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
And Mr. Atkins, if I may,
Yes, sir.
on a couple of points. One thing is, I do think the commission at some point will have to make a determination if, in fact, it wants to regulate, quote unquote, regulate public art outside of the historic district. To Ms. Brown's point, that is a policy decision that you will have to make at some point in this process. And excuse me, to Kate's point, I don't necessarily think that it would be a seismic shift to require a final design, in that, in fact, being a downtown property owner who has, in fact, completed a construction project within the last 5 years, I mean, we had to, my firm, my partners had to spend substantial sums of money in creating elevations and design plans to present to the AHB for approval prior to the construction of our law office. So I understand the fact that when we're dealing with a public nonprofit agency that has, we tend to maybe view budgetary concerns with a more sensitive light than we do for private enterprise and private commercial small business. However, I'm not sure that you should. If you're requiring complete designs for construction projects, I think it would be a failure of process to not require it universally.
Hasn't our guidelines always said?
Well, sure, and it says
design?
certificates of appropriateness shall submit as much information as possible, and that includes photographs, sketches. So it may not be down to the minute detail, but it should be enough that you can look, see what it's going to feel like, taste like, look like. I mean, you should have a general idea for sure, but that's within the purview of the board to require as much information as they want, and that is clear in the design guidelines as written. And the second point about a call to artists, I think we need to clarify this point. A call to artists would only be issued in the fact if the city of Danville wanted to commission art in a public place. All right, I don't know that they need to be a part of this public art discussion simply because it would be an inherently different process. You would have to select, and would be outside of the purview of the AHB even. You would have to decide, I want to have, or the city wants to have a statue in Whisker Park. And in that call, we would issue probably a request for proposals, which would be no different than what we would do for trying to select an engineering firm to make a master plan for Millennium Park. Now, we're not asking them to develop the master plan, but we want to know their qualifications of why they're doing it. What other plans have they developed in other communities? Not a plan for Danville, but what other sculptures have you done in other communities or on your own? And then you could review those to select the best qualified professional to deliver a product for you. Then you would pay them after they were selected to come up with the design. So that's the process that would be employed. If it was articulated in another manner, then I apologize for that. But that would be the process. It wouldn't be where we would say, you got to show us, come up with a design and then just let everybody, like the baptistry doors, and decide which one are we going to employ, and show all your cards, because that wouldn't be what we would do.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was a much better explanation, I think, because I thought I had to have the I's dotted and T's crossed when you said it the first time, so, okay. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have my stool today.
There you go.
Thank you. I agree with what Kate said, and I agreed with what Stephen just said. although other entities can also put out a call for artists. And we've been involved in things where after the call to artists, then maybe several are selected to present small replicas of a proposed design for which they are paid a small amount, like $200 or $300, just to generate a concept. Because you have to understand the creative process is the artist's product. So you can't ask them to do all their creativity on the hopes that they might get paid for it. So there are ways to work around that. In terms of regulating by scale, one of the roles of art is to kind of break the rules. So you know, if you think about the water tower when you drive to Versailles, or the big mural behind the transportation center in Lexington, that is, what, 6 or 7 stories high of Lincoln sitting in a chair, and I mean, it's pretty awesome. So, as I said before, you really can't codify artistic discernment, and you just end up with gray. You know, if there's 100 opinions and a certain size of everything, you're not going to get anything that stirs people, and that's what art is intended to do.
Thank you, ma'am. Someone else? He was on the edge of his seat.
I just wanted to respond to Stephen's comments. The one that I wanted to talk about was when you were talking about building or expanding your law office. When you partner with or hire an architecture firm to create an elevation, the design guidelines have enough content to understand what the building needs to look at, how it needs to fit into the downtown district. Art, it's not there. So as someone who's thinking about hiring an artist to commission a piece of artwork, if you're asking for a final piece, much like an elevation to present to the AHB, there's some risk factor there that people need to understand. The funding agency is assuming all risk for what if the AHB does not like the artistic style brought into question. So then you're out that money, and if you want to pursue the project, you have to start all over again from ground zero. And I just think it's important to say that when you do architecture, if a window is not in alignment and you want to change a window, change a roof line, it's a little bit easier to do that at that point than when you're working with an artist. Because if you don't like an artistic style, then you have to go all the way back to the very beginning.
Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to, I appreciate very much this conversation, and I hope that you're very open-minded in looking at all options. That's all I'm asking, is rather than looking at our current guidelines and seeing how we can tweak it or work within them, with what Steve said or with the various cities' comparisons. I just hope that we have an open mind and a broad perspective on this. So that's all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Again, Mr. Atkins, I want to encourage people, and especially those that represent other nonprofits in the art world, to make proposals. Submit those in writing to staff, and let there be some review before a recommendation is made. I mean, seriously, I mean, this is your call to do that. Before a failure to do that on the part of the community will result in staff making a recommendation to you that will then be received public comment on, which may or may not be tolerable, seriously, to you and to the various interests. Now, what you present may not be adapted in totality, however, components of it may be. And so I think this is, we've talked several times about a call to artists. Well, this is a call to the community. What do you want regulated in the downtown district or beyond? And now's the call and now's the time to do that. And I would say sometime, certainly within the next 30 or 60 days. Why not?
What's your deadline?
I don't have the authority to make a deadline. I'm just saying, if you're concerned about this issue, I would say 30 or 60 days to prepare something. I mean, I don't anticipate staff bringing a recommendation to you before the end of the year, certainly.
No.
And so I would just think there's no time like the present, but as you're thinking about these issues, make a proposal, a written one.
Yes, ma'am.
I like the ideas that talk about doing things in stages on this, all of them, every idea that had to do with doing things in stages, because it seems to me that it reduces the risk, the financial risk in particular, of the agency trying to make murals. And I would hate to see the risk become so great that it reduces our possibility of getting good public art. It's been really nice that we've gotten some nice things, and obviously there's a risk when you go in stages that at the very end stage that somebody may say, it's not what you explained, or it's not what we want, or it's not good. But it seems to me that the more stages in terms of the location, the design, the type, that it might reduce the risk of just losing all the money and having people not be able to go forward.
Thank you, ma'am. Someone else?
Of course, I'm going to chime in from this side of the.
Well, that's okay.
On Wilma's request that she's for a larger community that looks at the city larger than the historical district, I'm kind of curious if that doesn't fall over in your house, Mimi, but maybe I just don't understand in your role.
I don't feel that I have a separate role from anything. I
Yep.
feel like, the Arts Commission is something that supports arts and the artists in this community, and I look at that as this whole county. And actually for contiguous counties too.
Okay.
I'm not concerned. I don't think we're doing anything wrong. I think we're just kind of being very limiting in our thinking. We're talking, we just keep saying murals, murals, murals. Let's get the broader picture of public art, and that would open up thinking as well. That's, what I'm trying to
Yeah.
process and look at.
And I'm not saying shift it over to you. I just thought Wilma's idea and what you do.
I agree, we should be
Okay.
looking at the whole community, not to limit the community, but to increase the opportunity in the community. I would love to see something, three-dimensional, all kinds of things, all over the community, but I think that we do need to go about it in a consistent plan. I have felt that from the very beginning. I don't know if that's answering what you want to, or whatever, but.
Well,
And I do.
I think her idea is a good one, and this city is great in terms of we have lots of different organizations, and anytime I can see an opportunity not to create another one, but to combine it with something we already have going on, I want to ask about it.
Projects that were mentioned, Paducah, for example, that was a plan. That was not something that they decided, okay, let's put one here, and then let's see about putting one here. That was a huge plan. That was not a, let's see where we're gonna go with this. They went out, right, Joan? That was extremely, multi-year, step by step by step, not just a way, let's do something different here. It was a plan. So, planning can be very much a part of the artistic process and get where you want to go and not say, let's see what we might want to put there, sort of, and then see what happens in the end. That isn't the way, many projects are done in the country with a very thorough plan. Because you know what's going to happen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just talking here.
Oh, you would get a microphone.
I'm reminded of a Greek myth. I mean, I like the idea of setting rules and making it easy and all, but the Greek myth is of Procrustes, who was a god who had an iron bed of a certain size, and so if he was a thief or something, if he arrested you and you were too short, he'd stretch you out to make you fit his iron bed, and if you were too long, he'd cut off your feet. You know, and I think of the wonderful little sculpture that Buck Graham did in front of the brick place there. Okay, I'm sure he couldn't have put in much of a plan before that. The process of art is a creative art, and of course I'm thinking of our recent Sister City artist who, the last day before, he had this idea of the thing, that it would be really good to have a set of rules that you could apply, without much creativity, but you can't. And so just remember Justice Stuart Potter, when they were trying to define pornography, and the Supreme Court has really smart people. And finally, he said something that no one has ever, he said, I cannot define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And that, of course, drives some lawyers crazy. But that's, keep in mind, everybody, that art is not identifiable ahead of time. It's a process. And that finally it's kind of a humane, communal common sense. And I know we have to have committees and have to define it and so forth, but it's not like a building. It really isn't. And so just think of Procrustes. Don't be like Procrustes and chop off people's feet or stretch them out if you're too short. Finally, it's kind of common sense and in the sense of what's good in a humane way for the community. That has to take center stage.
Could I interject something? How do you spell Procrustes?
No, I'll ask him that.
I have my teacher voice on. I can speak to the tree exactly, because that tree was our concept. So the idea was tell the story of the founding of Kentucky. And it was to include what drew the settlers here, what attracted them to the idea of Kentucky, what they heard about, then when they got here, what they found. There was a distinct plan. I mean, No, of course not. But he brought it and he said, here, he had this blue paper and stuff. And he said, here, this is what I would like to do. And it was exactly what we had hoped he would do. We described it to, this is what we would like it to be. Here's the tree. Yes, it's an old stump of a tree. But this is what we would like you to portray, because it's Constitution Square. This is where it started. This is why they came, here. So, I don't know if that burst anybody's bubble, but he really did do exactly what we asked him to do in his own style. That's true, because I didn't say, I want the outline of Kentucky to be like a hemp rope. I didn't say that. But, yeah, wouldn't that be, that was a cool idea? And, yeah. So, that's how we did that process, step by step. And he researched the tree. That was a requirement. He had to research the tree. He had to find out whether the tree was carvable, how long to expect that particular tree might last, all things considered, the stump. He did every bit of that. He went into, the type, how the wood would be, how it would age. He did all of that in advance. It was not just hey, let's just see what happens if he. So we asked for a very specific process in that tree, and he did it, and we couldn't be happier with it. It's cool. It tells the story of Kentucky, the founding of Kentucky, and all the little bits and pieces. So.
It is a great example, though, right, of a project that would not lend itself to a final and complete design before anything else happened. Unfortunately, you all didn't have to go through that process because of where it was located. And I think that was kind of what Milton's point was, that type of sort of organic creation, absolutely planned, absolutely content was determined, but did he know that exactly 3/4 of an inch down from the top would be the start of this particular item, that it would
That's, I don't think that's,
They expected it to be, you know, this is what we wanted, and this is what we, but like he said, here's this, and here's that, whatever. You know, obviously, you can't control a knife or a saw, you know, quite as much as you can control a paintbrush. So there could be slip-ups as to what was gonna be a rope is now gonna be something else, you know? But I felt like, you know, it can be something that you can have a very good idea of what you are expecting going into it and not say, oh, anything that happens, whoa, whatever. No, I think you know, we do want to have, a reasonable expectation of what we wanted is what they did appropriate for that spot for Constitution Square. Would we put it on Center College campus? Of course not, you know, but for appropriate, I mean, I wouldn't think so, but, you know, appropriate for Constitution Square. And it was, we were tickled to death with it, you know, and, you know, do kids climb on it? Sure. Am I going to go out there and say, no, don't climb on it? No. Because I think it's really cool that they're interacting with the tree, you know.
Having done hundreds of layouts before there were computers, in using pastels or markers or, you know, miniature drawings of what I was proposing to a client, you can show somebody what your final product's gonna be before the presses roll or any money is spent, other than just being hired to provide a concept. So there is a way around being able to see it before it's done.
Thank you, ladies, for those comments. Anyone else?
One thing, and so let me just make a comment
sir.
or example when it goes bad and how all these things are related. We've got what I'll call a public piece of art right here in this community that went up right before Halloween that I got nothing but negative phone calls on Lenox Drive. Gentleman, under his own free expression, decided to install a solar panel and then a giant clock, lit clock, that everyone in the neighborhood said the planning and zoning ruined Halloween for all the kids. The neighborhood's so lit up. I looked at that as yard art, as most zoning ordinances define what we call yard art or public art or freedom of expression. I've seen all kinds of things over the years that would be interesting comments that we'd all probably, you know, discuss why someone chose to put a 100-foot flagpole with a pirate flag in their neighborhood. Thank God for restrictive covenants and HOAs, but there is a relationship between the zoning ordinance here, because the zoning ordinance defines what a structure is, community-wide, whether it's public art, freedom of expression, a mailbox. We define what a structure is, so there has to be some relationship of scale and parameters to this, setbacks, heights. They can be flexible, and in the example of this clock that's out there, I don't think I care if it's 50 foot tall. But really, probably don't need a structure that's taller than the house. Regardless of what their feeling was, there's some scale that needs to be there for the neighborhood. Didn't need to be a foot behind the sidewalk. Maybe it needed to be 10 foot back. I think there has to be standards on these things. And we have to think about that because the zoning ordinance is going to catch these, unfortunately. We can talk about public art all day and whether it's exempt or not. We get outside the historic district, we're talking about permits. We're talking about setbacks. My book doesn't deviate from those things just because it's public art. If it's in the site triangle, if it's 80 foot tall, I got to figure out what to do with it on our side. And a lot of times I just say, hey, it's art, looks good. Hope your neighbors like it. It's like I did on the clock. And I think I have an out on that one, Stephen, somehow. But I think we need to think about this community-wide and think about structures in art, where we want them, and think about them when they're on private property. And then how the zoning ordinance either needs to address that or exempt that if we can figure out a way to do that. Because I really need that, actually. So. And I recommend you guys go check that out on Lenox, and you guys probably already heard about it.
This neighbor loves that clock. I know if I'm late or not.
That's good. Thank you.
I've seen it.
Rick and I have not gotten any calls at all about it, right?
Yeah. It actually also serves as a real nice street lamp because it's pretty bright.
It's a new designated school bus stop. what I've identified it for. Someone else? If not, I want to thank you for your attendance and especially thank you for your participation. And it's always good to get together in this community because we can do it in the right fashion, in an orderly fashion. I want to thank you for that. So the chair would like to entertain a motion for adjournment.
Could I say one thing? I want to just remind
yes,
everybody
sir.
about what Stephen said. If you have some ideas, and
Oh, yes.
get them to Ron or get them to one of us, and we'll make sure they get where they need to be. So
Yeah.
we'd like to hear your ideas. Because we don't want to own any of this, so we want to hear your ideas.
Entertain that motion?
Move to adjourn.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you, guys.